Okay. What saved me from carpal tunnel, it looks like. Thank you, everybody, for coming down today to hear me talk about the California current, which is this talk is actually an outgrowth from a talk that I did first for the Friends of Mount Tam, because they asked for an explanation of what makes the weather so unique on Mount Tam. So I put this talk together for them about a year and a half ago. And then there was a member of the Marin CNPS chapter there, and she said, can you come give that talk for us? So I was able to give that talk then. And then Susan saw that and said, oh, you got to come give that talk for us. Each time I've given the talk, it's grown a little more. So we're going to go a little deep in the weeds on a couple of the concepts here. I know we titled this the California current, and we are going to spend a lot of time talking about the California current. But the inspiration for the talk really was first and foremost the marine layer, because that really is what makes the weather on Mount Tam so unique. But quite honestly, that's what makes the weather throughout the entire Bay Area so unique for at least 5 months out of the year. So the talk that we're going to go through tonight, we're going to start marine layer, but then in order to understand marine layer, you've got to understand the California current. It's the whole reason we have a marine layer, because of this current of ocean water right off our coast. And then if you want to understand the California current, then that becomes a global perspective on, well, what's up with these ocean currents and our place in that much larger pattern. So we're going to take a little bit of time. This talk is actually going to bring us to Japan briefly and the coast of South Africa briefly. To tie this all together. So bear with me while we do that. And then at the end of it, when there's time after that, we'll branch into a little more, 2 other aspects that are fascinating about our weather outside of the marine. So to start with, we've got this classic view. Everybody recognizes the silhouette of Mount Tam, right? This is from our camera on top of the Salesforce Tower, looking out over Mount Tam. And it is a time lapse. That's the response I was hoping for. There's no whoa back there. I could look at this and have looked at this a lot, actually. So there's a lot happening in that time lapse. We're seeing the marine layer surging on shore as it rushes in through the Golden Gate. But if you take a look at the hill there, that's Sausalito, where you can see the, let's go back, see if we can bring that back to the beginning, where you can actually see the fog is doing something. It's coming over the crest of the hill, and then it's kind of cascading down. So I'll come over here, and I apologize for our friends who are online, but I'm pointing right now to that little fog, what I refer to casually as a fog fall. It's not a technical term. I've never heard anybody else use it, but I think that's just what you need to describe what's happening.
Why is it getting sucked down?
That's a great question. And we're going to cover that. And you'll see it in the next image too. It's not only getting sucked down, but as we play this again, watch what happens. It goes down, and then back there, it arcs back up. Anybody see that? It's almost like a ramp. And in that sense, it's almost behaving like a stream, very much like just another fluid going over a terrain barrier, just like you see it in a stream. The same thing is happening here. Part of the reason for why it's going down has to do with, well, why is there a very clearly defined top to the cloud? I mean, oftentimes the marine layer is high enough. It's not going over the terrain because the clouds are too high. We're looking up at the base of it 2,000 feet high, and you're not, there's the lights of Sausalito right there, 101. So what's forcing it to go downward like that is there is a force pushing down on the top of that cloud, and it's pushing it back down on the other side. Here's another one. The time lapse we just saw was from the top of the Salesforce Tower. This is from the camera on the top of Mount Diablo. And you're looking back towards Mount Tam. Again, you can see Mount Tam off in the distance. So what I love about this time lapse is we're watching this beautiful phenomenon From the vantage point of one marquee peak of the bay, looking out across to the one of the other marquee peaks, and as they both sit high enough that they are above the top of the marine layer. So you get this beautiful view. Once again, everybody see the fog fall there happening again? And then it's doing the same thing where there's a ramp where it's arcing back up again, downstream. Oh, that's cool right there. You can really see it. It is just like a river, and we're going to get to that very topic here in the next image. And there come the lights. That's 24 coming down through Walnut Creek. And yeah, so there's a cap on this as well, holding the marine layer there. But there's one other thing I want you to see. That's obviously out over the ocean. And you see how the clouds are going from screen right to screen left. That's north to south. Yet in the foreground, they're going almost 90 degrees perpendicular to that. They're going direct from west to east. And there goes that dip again. And there are the East Bay Hills, and there goes the sunset. And I just happened to capture this from our camera network that we have. We do time lapses all the time. And when you're time lapsing the marine layer, it's often impossible to not get something that just looks spectacular. But the level of that cloud is what matters. The reason why we got that fog fall is because there was a force pushing down and capping the marine layer at about, right, the East Bay Hills are maybe like 1,500 feet high, right? So the cap of the cloud was only there at about 1,500 feet. Those clouds can and often do go much higher than that. They often can and do go much lower than that to where the marine layer does not get over the East Bay Hills. It stops, and you'll see that in 1 second. So we're talking about the depth in the atmosphere to which the marine layer is being allowed to rise because of this invisible force that is pushing down on it. And that's part of the theme that we're going to build out here to understand the marine layer. One of my favorite photographs from a plane somebody captured flying in over the city. So you've got your orientation. Remember how we were looking at the two different directions of the clouds? One of them was going north to south down the coast. One of them was going 90 degrees and going inland. Well, there's that little patch doing the same thing, going inland at 90 degrees. It was really the marine layer which inspired this talk more than anything, not just because it has such an overwhelming influence on the weather that we experience, but because it's such a beautiful aspect of living here. And I think if there's going to be an aspect of the weather that inspires people or connects us or makes us ask questions living here in the Bay, more often than not, it's going to be seeing this play out in so many different varieties and forms. Different kinds of, the fog falls are one example, but what you have here is the marine layers coming in and it's melting. I should say evaporating, but it looks kind of like it's melting as the sun hits the top of it. And then you get these puffy little cotton balls that are left over, caught up in that conveyor belt still streaming in, these broken little clouds. Oftentimes, we're left with one simple term for this. You'll either hear it referred to simply as fog, right? The Bay Area's fog. Or sometimes people will take it the next level and they'll refer to it as the marine layer. Both of those terms are actually incorrect.
Right, his name's Carl.
Then there's Carl. Thank you for that. Somebody actually just asked me the other day how I felt about Carl. And I love that term. It's very whimsical and it does draw people in. But even the fog part, Carl gets wrong all the time. Sometimes Carl is fog. Most of the time, Carl is not. The technical definition for fog is a cloud on the ground. Sometimes we do definitely have fog in this expression of the clouds, but the overwhelming majority of times it's not. You need a different term for this. And not to mention there's so many different varieties of it that we see. It takes so many different shapes and forms that the Eskimos, and this is not true, but I know probably many people have heard this said, the Eskimos had 50 different words for snow. Well, what would they think of us when it comes to the marine layer in this, where we're pretty much limited to just fog or marine layer for all of these different varieties of expressions that we see in the cloud. So here's a view from the plane, seeing the stratus cloud that is within the marine layer streaming in through the Golden Gate. And I just want to, explain what I mean by that in terms of accurately labeling this, because at that point, that's what that is. It's a stratus cloud within the marine layer. But we need an explanation of what the marine layer is, because the marine layer is not that deck of gray clouds that we see overtaking us. That's a stratus cloud that is within the marine layer. So what I want to at least clarify is what a marine layer actually is, and why so many times when we believe we are labeling that cloud as the marine layer, we're kind of doing a disservice to the process, because we're only speaking in halves and we're not really thoroughly expressing the concept for what it is. So all those answers are coming in 1 second, but I'm just building it up with the theatrics that Carl the Fog offers, and that the beautiful scenery of this offers. So somebody said it's just like a fluid a moment ago. Did somebody say that? It looked, the clouds looked like a fluid.
That was me.
So thank you very much. My pluvial, sitting next to my pluvial file over there. So how many people have seen this image before, or depiction of this? Yeah, show of hands. We've got about 3-4 people. So what you're seeing is the map of the topography of the bay. So you can see there's San Francisco, obviously, there are the Marin headlands. And then what the USGS did here is they color-coded the seafloor, the bay floor, by depth. So the orange areas, I believe those are something like maybe 60 feet deep. And the deep blue area, right where the Golden Gate is 300 feet deep. And it's exposed bedrock down there. Everything else is based in mud or sand.
Is it naturally that deep?
Yeah.
Yeah.
395 feet deep, it is not this point at median.
So what she just said is it's 395 feet at its deepest point.
At median tide.
At median tide, meaning according to where the water is, and you go 395 feet down. Yeah. But I'm just throwing 300 feet out there as a general term for that trench that has been scoured through the Golden Gate from a fluid that every day is getting forcefully squeezed through that narrow gap that's just a mile long. Picture all of the water in the bay, matched, of course, by an entire ocean on the other side. And every day, twice a day, an incredibly intense force is pushing and squeezing that large mass of water in and out of that one tiny little mile wide gap. So what happens to a fluid, in this case water, is the pressure gets pretty intense and the speed gets intense, and the strength with which that water's flowing through that gap daily has scoured out a 300-foot trench where those forces become the greatest, right at the Golden Gate, right under the bridge. So when you go over the bridge, the water depth there is a very different story than the rest of the bay. Most of the bay itself, like if you get out towards like Central Bay, South Bay, it's like 15, 20 feet deep. And a lot of it, like once you start to go south from here, you can walk out and be waist deep. You get down towards like Dumbarton Bridge and all that stuff. It's not very deep. I think San Pablo is also quite shallow as well. So what you also see in this image, you see the trench. Now, either look directly west of the trench or into the bay. Do you guys see the ripples? Like they look like the kind of casual ripples that you would see just walking along the beach or a lakeshore or stream shore. Those are actually sand waves that are about 30 feet high each individually. And that is where the sand that's being scoured out of that trench is being deposited on either side as the tidal forces scour the sand and then deposit it immediately down or upstream of the Golden Gate. Anyway, that was a long discussion, because what the marine layer is doing is the same thing, but in a different fluid. So here you've got water, which has a lot more mass to it, a lot more energy, and a lot more strength than the air that is also getting squeezed through this gap, not by a tidal cycle, but by the atmospheric forces that are pulling cooler air into the bay. And in fact, when you look at it in that image, what you're seeing there is the cooler air that is getting, and there's a very legitimate way to think about this, sucked into the Golden Gate because it is so much hotter inland that heat rises The air's got to be replaced as it rises. And one of the closest places to reach for more air is that huge available patch of much cooler water right off our coast that's getting pulled in through the Golden Gate. And if you take a look, you see how it's curving to the left there? That happens regularly on satellite images, like this one. Now, it's really small on there, but you can see the same thing happening. And that's getting pulled to the left because it's generally following that flow towards the Carquinez Strait out into the Delta. So you can actually see a little bit of that curve here, where that force is evident from where this air is being pulled. So the fluids respond in much the same way. And it's helpful to have that concept in mind if we're going to try to understand all of these wonderfully charismatic ways with which we see the marine layer behaving. It's just another fluid like water, which you get the ripples, you get the waves, and you have that downward force. And we're going to get to that in a second, because there is an invisible force regularly pushing down on the marine layer. So that it's kind of small on here, but hopefully you can see this is animating. It's a satellite loop, and you can see the marine layer now this is from 20,000 miles up. This is where the geostationary satellite is that looks down. So a somewhat higher vantage point than that really cool picture that we saw from the plane, but we're looking at the same exact thing. What I call that little ribbon of fog, that little finger of fog that is getting pulled into the Golden Gate, and then it's hitting a barrier, which is the East Bay Hills. So the time lapse that we saw a moment ago, the marine layer was actually cresting the East Bay Hills, and we got that really cool wave downwind. In this image, the marine layer is not cresting the East Bay Hills because that force pushing down on it is pushing a little more strongly in this particular day, and the marine layer is not allowed to be high enough to get over the East Bay Hills and do that wave. But what it is doing, kind of like a fire hose here, which is like the image that I kind of think of, a fire hose of cool, wet, gray air hitting the East Bay Hills. So this is where I'm actually going to take one moment in this talk and discuss a native plant. Probably the most charismatic native plant, in my opinion, the coast redwoods. So this is taken in the East Bay Hills. This is near Reinhardt Regional Park. I think the name has changed now. It's East Bay Regional Parks. There's Reinhardt. There's a couple of other names that are given for all those second growth redwood forests that have regrown in the East Bay. Well, before we needed second growth redwoods to grow back, it was an ancient old growth redwood forest, which by certain accounts tells us was where you could find some of, if not the largest coast redwoods in the range, in the East Bay Hills. Arguable on that because there's a lot of big redwood trees out there. Humboldt's got some really big ones. Yeah, but in particular, this stretch of the East Bay where I took this picture is where it's believed some of, if not the largest redwoods that were in existence at the time were, right here in our backyard in the East Bay. And where I'm standing, and I'll come back to what the historical plaque is in a second, but where I'm standing is that section of the East Bay that is, on a regular basis in the front lines, right in the crosshair of that hose of pressurized, wet, moist, gray marine layer getting squeezed through the Golden Gate forcefully and it hitting the East Bay Hills and stopping right there. And you can see it spreading out a bit, and it is kind of getting forced up a bit, which then causes the moisture to condense out even more. So you've got a very wet, damp bullseye right there. So are you guys kind of getting the picture for why it is that the East Bay Hills very likely had some of, if not the largest redwoods throughout the range? That's kind of an ideal location. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the redwood range. This is the only gap in the coast for 1,000 miles where you have that very narrow constriction. And the marine layer keeps getting pulled in and forcefully projected forward like that. You see it come on shore in Monterey. You see it also come on shore here. That's the what's that?
When people talk about, yeah.
That is Petaluma Gap right there. Yeah. That's another gap, but the Petaluma Gap is a broad, wide opening. I mean, look what the clouds are doing. It's almost right. It's almost like Monterey in that way. Same way, Monterey's got it as well. The LA basin, you know, that's not so much, but at least it's a flat basin where it comes in. This is the only place for 1,000 miles where you get that fire hose effect because of a 1 mile wide narrow constriction. So
This area right here, and it happens to line up with an old growth of redwoods.
does it through there? Cool.
That's an old growth one.
It's at the center.
So,
No.
over by La Honda?
Like, Redwood City, like, where is that, why it's further south, where, Hidden Village is, on that whole area in there. Huh? I don't know what it's called, and I just know that there's a old grove stand there, in the hills between Hidden Villa and Coast. And you think it's right on? Yes.
There are gaps like this up and down the coast. We're right next to one. The San Bruno Gap is a famous one just on the south side going to the airport, where the winds will really whip through there. Not quite as dramatically as the Golden Gate, though. So what the historical plaque says is the Blossom Rock navigation trees. Show of hands. How many people have heard this story of the Blossom Rock navigation trees? It's called Blossom Rock because there is a rock projection in the bay called Blossom Rock that was notorious for sinking ships in the early days of ships coming into the bay. When the ships would come into the bay, maybe there's a better, I don't really have a good image of the bay right now, obviously, but there's the bay. They would use these two extremely large redwood trees growing on this ridgeline in the East Bay, which is right where that fire hose is hitting, as their navigation guide to line up to make sure they were not going to hit Blossom Rock. So just following along with this story of they're gone. Yeah. There's only stories about them. If anybody ever takes the time to go to this marker, there's another plaque which shows all the old maps and shares the old written descriptions from people who were coming into the bay, and they were very well known and used as a navigation tool. And they were so large that you could see them from the Central Bay and line your ship up by them. Those trees were there very likely as a result of being part of that kind of flow in the marine layer, which was lined up beautifully. That's where they were. It's in the East Bay Hills, and I wish I could say more specific. Above, more so above Berkeley, and I think one of the better ways to think about it is Reinhardt Regional Park. Yeah, it's right. Oh, it's right by Chabot Space and Science Center. It's not far from there. Yeah. Okay. So here's a wider view of the marine layer. And this is kind of a typical summer day where you have this expanse of that stratus cloud, that gray. So a stratus cloud, by the way, just from Meteorology 101, is where you get an expansive blanket of clouds, right? You've got cumulus clouds. Those are the really pretty puffy cotton balls. You've got cirrus clouds. Those are the wispy paintbrush clouds that you see at higher elevations. A stratus cloud is kind of just what, you know, from a geological standpoint, think of stratum. It's just an expansive deck of cloud that goes and goes. It's connected, it's continuous. That's a stratus cloud. So what most people are referring to when they refer to the marine layer, they're really referring to the stratus cloud that is within the marine layer. So here's a view from, again, that same satellite, now just zoomed out. You could probably even see, this might even be the same day, because you can kind of see the fire hose going into the bay. 20,000 feet high, getting a broad expanse of the marine layer that develops off the coast. So what is it about the coast of California that is so good for 5 months out of the year? at creating and developing this stratus cloud, which comes in so many different forms as our fog, Carl the fog ball, all that stuff. And oh, that one actually loops as well. Well, we can start to unravel this discussion and answer that question in terms of why is that stratus cloud always there? When we look at another feature that is also a fairly regular constant in that stretch of Pacific Ocean right off our coast, this is an image provided by NASA where they're using a sensor on the satellite to depict life in the ocean. It's a phytoplankton bloom, which is another aspect of this unique patch of water off our coast. It's highly productive. It's really good at creating stratus clouds. It's also highly productive from a phytoplankton standpoint, and phytoplankton is then the building block of the entire food web that draws ultimately this great show of humpback whales, gray whales, all of the pinnipeds, you name it. It's one of the most biologically diverse coastlines in the world. Our kelp forests being a large factor of that. And if there's time in this talk, we'll also touch a bit on the bull kelp. But what we're doing right now in the talk is we're unraveling all of this. We know we've got this beautiful display of fog. We know it's part of this much larger constant stratus cloud off the coast. We know this much larger stratus cloud off the coast is because there's something very unique about the patch of water that runs up and down California for 5 months of the year. The California current, no surprise, that's what the label of this talk is. So let's delve into the California current a little bit. I mean, show of hands, how many people here have ever even used the words California current in a sentence?
Is it different?
Huh? The question was, is there a Humboldt current? And the answer is there most definitely is, and we're going to see it in this talk, because there is a very close relation. It's one of the other examples throughout the world where you see this. So the California current, first, just an explanation for where it's coming from, and then I'll show you what the California current actually is and why it's there. But quite simply, the California current is just that very cool stream of much colder water flowing down the coast of California. We'll see some visualizations of it in a second, but just for the way I've got the order of the talk going, this is where the atmosphere comes in back into this discussion of the California current. Every summer for about, or even more than that, about 5 months out of the year, California's atmosphere is dominated by a semi-permanent ridge of high pressure, which sits over that section of the Pacific Ocean. And for a little more meteorology 101, high pressure probably conjures a number of things in most people's minds. Warmer temperatures, no rain, clear skies. High pressure tends to put a lid on the atmosphere, which is where we're going to get back to that cap on the marine layer, which controlled how high it goes. That's high pressure doing that. So we've got this semi-permanent ridge of high pressure for 5 months out of the year, which sets itself up off the coast of California. This is why it doesn't rain here in the summer. And growing up in LA, as I did, I was shocked one summer when I finally traveled far afield and there was intense thunderstorms happening in July. I was in Montana outside. I really was. I was working there for the summer, and I was working there as a tour guide of all things. So I was supposed to be incredibly knowledgeable about where I was, but this was early, and I hadn't yet anyway. And I turned to one of the other veteran tour guides, and I said, "Wow, I've never seen anything like this. And have you ever seen this?" He said, "I didn't think this was possible in the summer. You're not like mesmerized by all of this with questions." He goes, "Dude, where I grew up, this is what the summer does. You get thunderstorms." So it's not normal for us in California to be so vacant for 5 months out of the year. Not only no thunderstorms, but no rain. I mean, on average in the Central Valley in July, there is zero measurable precipitation in that month of July. There's very few places in the country where you can say that. So not only is there high pressure set up out here, high pressure also from Meteorology 101 spins clockwise. Spins the atmosphere clockwise. That's a theme we're going to come back to again when we get to the gyre, which is a fun word to say. If you've never used California current in a sentence, wait till we get to gyre. So high pressure spins clockwise. I'm sure most people are aware of that basic concept of meteorology. So picture the wind spinning clockwise here. And let's see if I can get that to play again, just so we can get that visualization. There are wind streams on this animation playing. And if you look at it real closely as the resolution clears up, you see that if this is spinning clockwise, and that's generally the location the center of the high sets up for about 5 months, that means off the coast of California for 5 continuous months with occasional breaks, but not many, there is a steady supply of northerly winds down our coast. Anybody ever gone to our coast in the month of June? Point Reyes, Mendocino coastline, June or July? It's awful. It's awful. The wind is so abusing. You're just constantly in these strong winds. You see it out over the water too. Usually white caps, usually beautiful surface patterns as the water is moving and you're getting slapped in the face. It's also usually a time where it's foggy, June and July. All of these things are connected. So now we're getting a little closer to understanding the concept of the California current, which we're going to use that information to come back once again to what we mean when we say marine layer. Because you first have to have a concept of what the California current is before you really can understand what the marine layer is. And that's what I'm building up to here. Okay, so picture this, right? We're looking out towards the coast. You see where the north is on that? So like to the left would be up towards Humboldt, to the right would be down towards Monterey. Let's say we were looking at like Mount Tam, or that's kind of around where Stinson Beach is. So you can see the wind moving north that we were just also visualizing in the previous image where that high pressure is spinning around and there's your constant northerly winds. What those winds are doing is they are constantly pushing the surface of the ocean along with them. So you are removing the top layer of water regularly from all this wind. So that water's got to be replaced in some way. We're not seeing the depths or the heights of the water disappear as the surface is getting pushed away. That water is getting replaced, and it's getting replaced by water from underneath, which is being pulled up to take its place. And because it's not the wind that is moving from north to south, because of a convoluted concept on a spinning sphere like we are, it's not necessarily just north to south. It's the water isn't getting pulled directly north to south. It's actually, very strangely, and this kind of would require its own talk in a whole other class. But the water isn't necessarily moving north to south. And you can see what the arrow is doing. The water is actually going perpendicular to that. It's getting pulled from west to east. In other words, to the right. So it's the Coriolis effect. I'm not going to spend much time going into that in this lecture. Just trust in the concept that because we live on an enormous spinning sphere, weird things happen because of that spin. On the large scale, it's the whole reason why high pressure spins clockwise, by the way, and low pressure spins counterclockwise. If you're in this hemisphere, if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's backwards. How far down this rabbit hole do you want to go? It's a little. And by the way, that only applies to large bodies of water. This is not why your toilet bowl spins a particular way. That's way too. The Coriolis force has no impact on your toilet bowl. So back to this discussion, constant pressure of wind removing the surface of the water. The water is not necessarily getting pulled from north to south. The water is instead going 90 degrees perpendicular to that. It's getting pulled from west to the east, which means where we live on this part, because of the orientation of the coast, that water is getting pulled away from the coast. You can kind of see it illustrated in that arrow where it says upwelling. So as the surface water is getting blown away by the wind, you've got this mass of water that is getting pulled up in this upwelling current to take its place. That water off our coast is coming up from about an average of 400 to 600 feet down. So not only is it much colder down there, But it's also pulling up a lot of the nutrients that are down there, which are helping to fuel the phytoplankton and that massive explosion of life. Those two are connected. And when I gave this talk the first couple of times, I just brushed over that concept, but I got curious and I said, well, why is there so much, why are all these nutrients, what is it about 500 feet down that there are all these nutrients that when brought up enable this huge explosion of phytoplankton, which then causes our coast to be a profusion of sea life? So I'm going to try and cover that too in 1 second. But for right now, I've got to talk about the weather aspect of it before we go too far down that rabbit hole. So where we find ourselves in the talk now is a basic understanding after all of that for why the water is so cold off our coast. Generally, it's in the mid-50s in the summer. If you go off the coast of Florida, it'll be in the mid to upper 80s. It's a huge difference, and we'll also see some images there. So the upwelling, here's another way of looking at it from an Ocean Services NOAA image explaining upwelling and also explaining the nutrient-rich water. So that water is getting pulled up from about 500 feet down, and then it's bringing up some of the nutrients with it, which is why you see this visualization provided from NASA, where you can see the color-coded phytoplankton blooms. Just a brief discussion on why those nutrients are there before we get into the impact that this cold water has on the marine layer. But here's a little side trip. Ocean-wide, there's this constant feature happening throughout the ocean, more so in areas where you've got more biology. There are huge swaths of the Central Ocean, which are essentially deserts when it comes to any life of any kind. But where you've got life, you've got death and you've got decay. And across the oceans, there is this feature which is known in the scientific field that looks at this as marine snow. It's the decomposition, primarily of phytoplankton blooms, but also everything else, defecation, death, decomposition. All of it turns into this constantly falling down marine snow. You've probably seen it in movies, like when they go down and you see the deep submersible movies down at the base of Monterey Canyon. Oftentimes, you know, there's this constant flow of stuff coming down. So there's kind of a close-up view on the right of what a little particle of this marine snow looks like. So the marine snow settles on the bottom of the ocean floor. The ocean has a whole series of conveyor belts flowing through it. It is not static. So what happens in one part of the ocean is ultimately going to get transported to all other parts of the ocean or another part of the ocean. Now, I'm not an oceanographer, so I can't go too far down this. I just wanted an answer to the question myself for what is it about 500 feet down that's providing all of these nutrients? The conveyor belts moving through the ocean, right? Think everybody's, has anybody heard of AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current? It's a big concern in climate change right now as a potential tipping point. If anybody ever see the movie The Day After from 20 years ago, the concept in that dealt with AMOC. AMOC is part of this conveyor belt that it's just one small piece of it that happens up around Greenland, where the water gets either pulled down and then pulled into this network of conveyors moving across the rest of the ocean. So you can see California's got a little branch of this, that little blue line, number 6, where it says California current, but it also shows a deep ocean current. So we've got a little conveyor belt that is constantly transporting water at depth down to that 500-foot level. That's been brought from other places across the rest of the globe. So essentially, this is where all the nutrients are coming from. That marine snow, which is constantly filtering down to the ocean floor, is getting then caught up in this conveyor belt, brought to all different parts of the globe. And then when our upwelling takes over, what happens to that marine snow is it's no longer the marine snow. It breaks down to just its compound nutrients. Phosphate is a big one. And there's a few other in there. Maybe it's nitrogen. Okay, this is where I start to go far outside my field of expertise. But that organic matter is returned into the basic building blocks, not of life, but of nutrients that life need to feed on. And this is all now getting brought up right off our coast in a fairly regular basis. And that's why the phytoplankton bloom and the explosion is happening off our coast. So 500 feet down, upwelling, phytoplankton bloom. I apologize for putting you all through that, but I was curious. So that's about enough of an explanation as I need. I mean, it's a much more involved story than that. Oh, here's the last thing I want to say on this, about why I did this in this talk. There's a particular acid that is making the crab inedible.
Diagonal.
Yeah, who wrote it? I'm going to refer to my notes. Domoic. Domoic acid is a term that's getting used in the media often because we got to tell the story of why you can't eat crab right now. Why has the crab season been closed? Back in April, there was a particularly bad, April of this year, there was a particular bad case. It was happening down in Southern California where there was an increase in this domoic acid. And it was really impacting the seals, the sea lions, and the birds, creatures that are higher up on the food chain. Because if you eat one of these bivalves or crustaceans that has been infected with this, it doesn't affect them, but it affects the omnivores or the carnivores who eat it. Just to close out this idea of this conveyor belt, and in the description of this talk, I mentioned how the California current is an aspect that connects our coast to the rest of the world. Well, this conveyor belt is that example. They couldn't figure out why there was this explosion of domoic acid that was showing up and killing all of these seals and sea lions. There were two ideas. One was maybe this has something to do with the toxic runoff from the fires in January in Southern California, because it was really happening down there. Santa Monica, that whole bay, a lot of it was showing up there. There was one theory that the toxics were flowing into the ocean, and then that was helping to fuel this domoic acid outbreak. But there was a researcher I spoke to down at UC Scripps who said to me, well, there's one concept that I think a lot of people are not aware enough about, which is the interconnectedness of our oceans. The domoic acid is coming up from these nutrients that are then getting into the phytoplankton and then getting ingested. That's the point source. And she said, and in that case, we have no idea where this could be coming from because this is a global connected pattern. And that stuff could be coming from the equator. It could be coming from anywhere. So trying to piece back that story of what was fueling that particular outbreak of domoic acid ties us back in to the conveyor belts that are global. And of course, the conveyor belts role in why our coast is so biologically productive, because it is a constant influx of those necessary phytonutrients that then feed the phytoplanktons. And okay, we're moving on from that subject. How are we doing on time? Anybody know where we are, Susan? 8:24. Okay, so okay. So that was a side trip. We're coming back now to the focus of our talk, which is, well, if I shouldn't refer to the cloud as the marine layer, what is the marine layer? And this is where we're going to answer that question. It's an image showing sea surface temperatures across the globe. So you can see how warm the water is down towards the equator. You can see how cool it is in the Gulf of Alaska. But do you notice, you guys all see the California current in that image? So let's come in for a closer look at the California current. Really close. And this is where we're going to use Mount Tam as our example for how the marine layer has an influence on the weather that we all experience here. Closer view, now you can see it, there's your 50-degree water, typically like 55 degrees off the coast. We'll come in for a closer view now and zoom into the bay, and we'll get our vantage point for where we are with the topography of the bay. And now we can see where Mount Tam is. And what we've done with that blue line, and we'll come in for a closer look at that. Okay. If the water off the coast is 55 degrees in July, that's when it's actually at its coldest. When we're supposed to be experiencing the warmest temperatures of the year, that's the very same time the water off our coast is getting the coldest, when the upwelling is at its strongest. So you've got this big reservoir of refrigerant now sitting off the coast. The atmosphere really wants to do a number on California in July and warm us up. Just go to Sacramento or Stockton, where you'll hit 105. But you've got this big reservoir of 55-degree refrigerant out here, which has an effect on the atmosphere directly above it. It cools it. So that layer of the air that's in regular contact with this 55-degree water starts to cool down almost to that same temperature, which is why it's so cold at our beaches through the summer, why San Francisco is always so cold. The coldest summer I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. That all ties back to this phenomenon taking place off our coast. It is all about the upwelling, the California current, the marine layer that we all then live in. So the definition of the marine layer is that layer of air that is directly above the water, that's utterly under the influence of this big cold reservoir. The marine layer of air has a limitation. It can only go so high as the prevailing atmospheric conditions above will allow. So remember, in the summer, we've got this semi-permanent center of high pressure. High pressure, we know, wants to warm the atmosphere up, it wants to keep the rain away. But the very definition of high pressure, what the meteorological term is trying to convey, literally, is the pressure is high. It's pushing down hard. You're compacting the air. You've got more air packed into a region. The pressure goes up, the intensity goes up on the surface, the barometric pressure, right? Even on us to a degree, the pressure will go up. And though some people are particularly sensitive to this, which is why when it's low pressure, they feel it in their joints, because there's been a release of pressure on it. The intensity of that pressure is not constant. It changes. When we go through particular spikes in heat, when we get a heat wave, that center of high pressure has strengthened. It is now pushing down even harder, which means it's going to limit the depth at which that marine layer is able to exist. So, if you think of how you see the clouds coming in through the Golden Gate in that endless variety, there are days where the clouds are coming in under the deck of the bridge. You can clearly see the bridge. And whatever marine layer, and in that case, it is fog because it's down on the surface of the water and it's coming down under the deck of the bridge. But then there are also many other days where that marine layer is coming in so high that it's above the towers. Those towers are about 740 feet high. And there are many days where the marine layer is coming in and you see it streaming in over the bridge, but it's not obscuring the bridge. And that is all the function of what the strength of the high pressure happens to be in that moment. So when we're going through heat waves, it's pretty low. So here's an example of an influence this has on the weather. There's our marine layer, right? On this day, as an example, and you're going to see some temperatures from 10 a.m. on this particular day on Mount Tam. On this particular day, the depth of the marine layer was about 1,500 feet. So you get above that line, that's the inversion, right? Another term in meteorology where we all know that the atmosphere gets cooler as you go higher. What an inversion is the opposite of that, where you're cooler in the marine layer, and as soon as you hit that inversion, you then move into a much warmer mass of air. It gets warmer as you go higher. So that's why they call it an inversion. It's the inverse of what typically happens. So let's follow this through. Here's a day. You've got your marine layer. You've got your lid on the marine layer, which is where the cap from high pressure is holding it. Oops. Let's go back and follow that through now and see the impact that has across the landscape using Mount Tam as our example. And Yeah, that was over Stinson. Yeah, let's see. I don't know, because this was, I used the weather computer that we've got at work to create this. So I can't remember where I lined it. Almost certainly it's got, yeah, there you go. Perfect. That's Stinson. You can see the lagoon back there. See those rolling grassing hills up on West Ridgecrest? You're going to see pictures from there when we finish this. So let's advance this now. Let's take that marine layer and extend it out across the landscape of Mount Tam. And this was the setup. So Mount Tam's about 2,500 feet high. Mountain Home on Panoramic Boulevard, I think it's 1,500 feet. We might have these numbers off a little bit, but generally that's where we are. You can see where Panoramic Highway is. So on this was actually May, 2 summers ago. It was a heat wave, particularly intense heat wave. So we were all getting hot. High pressure was capping the marine layer at about 1,500 feet. And at 10 o'clock oh, I got to go back. We got to do it again. Sorry. We'll play that through again. At 10 o'clock in the morning, there was such an intense inversion in the atmosphere that the temperature on the summit of Mount Tam, East Peak, was in the mid 90s. And at that same exact moment, 1,000 feet lower on Panoramic Highway, it was in the mid 50s. Just to show the dramatic influence that the marine layer can have. We oftentimes think of the marine layer having a very notable impact on how it feels because you went inland. And that's very true. That's the majority of the way this is experienced. But you don't have to go inland only to lose the influence of the marine layer. Sometimes if the marine layer is low enough, you just have to go high enough. And now you've gone into that inversion where you are now in the atmosphere over California for what the atmosphere in general really wants to do to us. That's what they're living with in Central Valley. We live in a bubble in the summer here in the Bay of just obliviousness to what summer is like at our latitude here in California because we are insulated by this huge reservoir of cold air right off the coast. One of the ways I like to think about this on a day like that, or in July when you walk out into San Francisco and it's 58 degrees and it's cold and you're putting on your jacket, I think it's amusing to think of it in terms of what you are really feeling on your skin at that point is the 500-foot down depths of the ocean. And that, because that is where that coldness on your skin came from. And that's what you're feeling. You're feeling the California current within the marine layer. And then sometimes you might see a stratus cloud above you within that marine layer. So, all right, let's see where we go with this. All right, that's the view from up on West Ridgecrest Boulevard, where you get the cap of the marine layer. These are pictures that were shared with me by, if you guys ever watch CBS News, our weekend sports anchor, Matt Lively, he moved here about 3 years ago. And he's just awesome. And he used to go up here with his friends. Not everybody gets as floored by this. You know, I think it takes a certain individual to really be inspired by this. He's certainly one of them. And he took these pictures one day. He had asked me the day before, he said, I have some friends coming from out of town. I need them to see that experience from West Ridgecrest, above Stinson Beach, where you're looking down over the clouds. What's the forecast? So I was trying to make sure I gave him a good day. And he got one. Those are people. Those are people on the ridge. Yeah. I don't know exactly where he was, but I'm almost certain he took this from near Trojan Point, depending on how many people know that drive. Trojan Point's really where you get this spectacular. There they are. There are your people. Never saw the dog before. So there's your cap. So what you're seeing here, the top layer of that stratus cloud is your visual. It's like you put dye within the marine layer, but instead of green or blue or whatever you see people put into fluids, it's a wet grayness. And that is showing you exactly where the cap is. That's your inversion. You now know where the intensity of high pressure over you at that moment is capable of pushing down and putting a lid on that marine layer, because that's what you're seeing. That's the top of it. There's another sciencey way to look at that. These are representations from something called an atmospheric profiler. So if you don't have the good fortune of standing on Mount Tam or knowing exactly where the depth of the marine layer is, and as a forecaster, if you want to know where the depth of the marine layer is, there are ways you can profile the density, because as I'm sure you would expect, the density of the air is also very different in that cool, wet dampness to just above that inversion, where all of a sudden it's much drier and much warmer, way less density to that air. What a atmospheric profiler does is it's able to depict where that line is. So if you look at it on here, this is the altitude in meter. You can do the conversion for feet for those of us. So like, that'd be like 900 feet, or 3 feet in the meter. So in this case, that's you'll use this for forecasting. This is also a time series. So this is now, that was then, and this keeps moving that way. So you can see what happened here is the marine layer became shallower and shallower over time. At there, it's, maybe 300 feet. So it's just a little bit of a peek to go a little deeper into the weeds, because I know oftentimes, and I'm assuming this crowd probably fits into this demographic, people like to, I know you do, people who like to see this kind of thing, right? It's a forecast tool. It's also just really a cool way to put all these meteorology is so good at this, at using all these psychedelic colors to put it into, a science graphic. So is that concept pretty clear? Does that make you? I look at these all the time, so I look at that right away and it makes sense. Is anybody who's not sure what we're looking at on here? Does it make sense? The profiler, and you can see where the inversion is. So there's our center of high pressure, which is responsible. There are a couple of other places in the globe across the globe where this happens. There are not many places. How are we on time, Susan? Yeah, so I'm trying to, how do I get past it?
To be down here. Is that? Hello.
There you go. Okay. So originally this talk moved on from there to transition into fall and winter. But I wanted to just take one step further and delve into this notion of currents. Somebody had asked about the Humboldt current, which is the sister current to the California current. It's exactly the same thing, only it's reversed on the southern hemisphere along the coast of Chile. And there's another one that goes along the coast of Southwest Africa. Back to our image where we're looking at sea surface temperatures, you can see the California current shows up here. Let's see if it'll play. Yeah, there we go. We widen out for view, and we're going to see, if you look at the coast of South America, there's another one. And this is an image that I just took from about 3 days ago. So we're coming into there early, well, it's late spring down there, approaching early summer. So their summer upwelling is just starting to kick in. So it looks a lot broader, but you can see the same thing is happening along the coast of South America. That's the Humboldt current. Same thing. One of the most biologically productive and diverse coastlines in the world happens there. And there's one other place that I want you to see this, just because for a phenomenon that's fairly limited, Carl the Fog has a relative in South Africa. And the picture, I think, is so cool, and a lot of people may not have seen this. So I just want you to see what happens right there in one of the few other places in the world. Did you guys see the cold current off Africa? Because I don't want to go back and replay that. I accidentally skipped. But this is Table Mountain above Cape Town, South Africa. They have a cold current as well. So the three we're touching on is California current, the Humboldt current, and I believe theirs is called the Buella. It's got a name. So they've got this massive cold air. Their topography is very different. So their version of the marine layer does not play out the same way. But they've got this huge mountain. It's a national park down there called Table Mountain. It gets a layer of fog, and that is literally fog on the top of Table Mountain. And you have a fog fall. Well, that's just my term for it. You got a fog fall spilling off the top of that ridge. There's another vantage point of it. High pressure capping it. And then once you lose the support of that mountain, the high pressure is going to push you down, right? If that cloud's going to spill off of that table. They've given this a name, which I think actually puts Carl the Fog to shame. When that phenomenon happens, and it's widely used down there, they call this the tablecloth. And you can see how it drapes over. And just a quick little, so there's South Africa. We know where their cold current is because we saw it briefly, right? Theirs flows from south to it's the other hemisphere, so it flows from south to north, it curves left, it's right, pulls the water off the coast, right? That way, where in that case it's turning left, it's not turning right, but the effect is the same.
Where's Table Mountain?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Because that does need to be zoomed in on. I just did this on Google Maps. It's a screen grab of me zooming in on, there's Cape Town. I've got to stop advancing to stop this. I'm gonna hit the K to stop. Right. If you could pick that up. Right. So what you got is exactly. Because it didn't form over the water. Right. Great catch. From that vantage point anyway. What happens here, so here's Cape Town. That's Table Mountain. This is where the cold current is. It's an orographic effect where that fog will form. It doesn't quite happen that way here. The fog just kind of forms readily on its own. But there's an onshore influence here where that air gets pushed up onto Table Mountain. That causes the cloud to develop, sit on top of the mountain, and then it was spilling over this way. So here's the town. So what you were seeing was the cloud coming over that way. So that, if anybody else caught that explanation, she was saying, well, why didn't the cloud start over the ocean? We were looking at it from the other side, where the onshore winds. So there's your. So we were looking at the cold currents. We know we've got the California current. We know where the Humboldt current is. We know where that current is off of South Africa. We've now touched on the 3 of 5 places across the globe where you get our Mediterranean climate. Our latitude plays a big role in our Mediterranean climate. But additionally, these cold currents along the coast also play a big role in a Mediterranean climate. And now you can see this, and who was it who was talking about this earlier, where you said they were trying to depict where Mediterranean climates were, and they put it between 30 and 45, and that's way too big. Because it doesn't just happen between those latitudes. You need a whole host of other things to align to get your Mediterranean climate. So these are our sister locations across the rest of the globe where that happens. Also, if you've got a cold current right off your coast, you do not have to worry about hurricanes. You don't have to worry about thunderstorms. We get thunderstorms. So sometimes the forcing can be strong enough, but we don't get hurricanes here. And that big pool, that big reservoir of cold water off our coast is a large reason for that. So I just thought this visualization what you're seeing on there are the tracks of every hurricane from 1945 to 2006, color coded. Deeper shade of red is Cat 5. So you can kind of see where the hurricanes happen, how they move across the globe. But for the purposes of this talk, I wanted you to see where they don't happen. So this cold current off our coast is also a shield against the kind of energy for uplift that the atmosphere would need to foster that kind of. And I won't go too deeply into this, but just like that semi-permanent center of high pressure spins the atmosphere clockwise, The ocean has followed that lead. And the Pacific Ocean is virtually in a constant state of clockwise spin. The California current is the, 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock experience of that spin. But it is a much larger spin that continues across the ocean basin as a whole. And while we've got the California current here, this is reversed in the southern hemisphere, so the same thing is happening for the Humboldt current. Those are called East Basin upwelling systems. The California current is an east, because you're in the East Basin of the ocean. It's an upwelling system. On the west side, you've got the Kuroshio current, which is a warm current. How many people are familiar with the Gulf Stream? The Gulf Stream is the identical expression of the Kuroshio current. They happen in both places. Those are West Basin warm currents. This is all connected. So that, where's that view of? There's the Kuroshio current off the coast of Japan with much warmer water. I won't go too far down the road on this because we'll just touch on that briefly because it's just nice to see the interconnectedness to this. And I'm just showing you the Northern Hemisphere stuff. There are correlatives to this in the Southern Hemisphere. But the west boundary warm currents flow much faster. They're actually much deeper than the East Basin cold currents. And they're much narrower. Think of the Gulf Stream. That's exactly what that is. That's what, and Japan's got a Gulf Stream, but they call it something different, but it's the same process that's happening. And there's a clear defining difference. You've got your West Basin warm currents, your East Basin upwellings. That's not an upwelling current. That's actually a downwelling current. So I won't go any farther into that discussion. We've shown the map for sea surface temperatures a few times tonight, and that's just straightforward. Here's what the sea surface temperatures are. We saw what the color code was for R55. We talked about how it's 88. This is a different way to visualize that. This is not sea surface temperature. This is sea surface temperature anomaly. So how far off of the normal average are you? So you guys can see the California current. Only if this is an anomaly map. And by the way, this is from June of this year. The California current this June was on overdrive. So it wasn't just cold. It was colder than average, which is what the anomaly map is communicating. Also, you guys see the Kuroshio current now on the other side of Japan. It was much warmer than average as well. In fact, Japan had a very unpleasant summer. High humidity, heat waves. You guys probably have forgotten this already because it didn't last long. But in May and June of this year and into July, we were talking about the coldest summer that San Francisco has had in something like 40 years. Anybody, it can be easy to forget this because we move on. We've had 3 atmospheric rivers since then. And these things, how many people remember that though, from this summer?
Well, what we really remember in Brisbane is the amount of wind.
Yeah.
Compared to Northern.
Yeah.
Really a lot of very high. Winds.
And that all ties back to the California current, which was on overdrive.
Yep.
It was colder there. It was the coldest summer in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. It was not that way for the rest of the state. They were doing what's happening. They were warmer than average. So why was it so windy in Brisbane this summer? You had this exaggeration of what a typical summer would be, only it was even colder. So the difference was, the pressure difference was more. So just a quick, if you look at the California current there in July, there's a close-up view of it. And here's the headline from the Chronicle, just to outline what we were talking about. Bay Area on track for coldest June in decades. You can't really have a conversation about why unless you've got at least some familiarity with the notion of a California current. which is why I wanted to see a show of hands for how many of you have ever actually even used the thing in a sentence. So now, hopefully, this broadens our understanding of something that is so fundamentally tied into what drives our weather. I'm going to zoom out from that image. Actually, I'm going to advance from that image to today. So this, by the way, this website's readily available from NOAA. National Visualizing, it's NVVL. It's a visualization laboratory. It takes some time to find this, but it's fun if you dig around on it. So you look at the transition from July to today, where the mass of warm air has changed. I'm of warmer than I had. So the California current,
Warm air or water?
and technically, I mean, I should even be more specific than that. Sea surface temperatures, because it's only, this is just on the surface. Yeah.
They think it's La Nina here.
We would see that if we looked at this on the global. You guys see where the equator is in there? It doesn't really show up that well because I don't have South America. I would need South America on here for that.
The equator's kind of like where that white band is.
Yeah, but La Nina really plays out along the coast of Peru and in that section of the equator as well. So you're right, if you are seeing cooler than average water in this image along the equator, that is tied in to La Nina. That's a complicated. The simple, straightforward answer to that is no. When you talk about El Nino or La Nina, you are very specifically referring to the sea surface temperature anomaly along the equator, off the coast of Peru, but even a little bit farther removed to the central. But there are global changes to sea surface temperatures when that happens. And, I mean, how many times have you heard stories during an El Nino where here in the coast of California, we've got fish coming up the coast of California we never see. So again, that's part of the global connections to all of this, but here's the last image on this is if we're on this image, this is today. We now have we're now warmer than average off our coast. And I'll just tie this into two discussions, which are also in the news. Crabbing season's postponed again. And what you're told, because it is the reason, is that the whales are coming closer to the coast and they are getting entangled in the crab pot mines. And that's typically where the story ends. A curious mind would have to wonder, why are they all of a sudden coming closer to the coast? One of the driving factors is this now fairly regular occurrence of warmer water just off our coast, which is driving warmer water out in the Pacific where they would typically be on their migration routes. They are now coming closer to the coastline largely because of it. This is a convoluted question. And again, I'm not a marine biologist, but this has been stated by the marine biology community that a leading factor is, I mean, when these things reach extremes, we start calling them marine heat waves. Marine heat waves, yes. The most famous marine heat wave was the blob, which happened back in 2015, 16. I don't know how many people remember hearing that.
That's one of my least favorite weathers, and it's so awful.
Yeah. Yep.
Very resilient. What they call it?
The ridiculously resilient ridge. That was a phrase coined by an atmospheric scientist named Daniel Swain, who is a name that I bet some of you have probably come to know. He's fantastic. He also coined the term weather whiplash, which has also gotten into the vernacular. The troubling thing about these marine heat waves is it's almost becoming the prevalent state now of the ocean. I'll show you one image that will kind of help. All right, so that's today. I'm going to show you an image of the sea surface temperature anomaly from 1990. That was kind of the norm. So we've entered into a new phase now in our oceans where you've got to shift your whole baseline for what average is, because that is now a moving target. So when we visualize these sea surface temperature anomalies, we're basing it against those, the 1990 times that you take a 30-year chunk and every 10 years you move that 30 years up. That's how you do your your averages. So I think the immediate visualization of how our oceans have changed, hopefully that helps kind of drive that point home. But just two other items on this. If we take a look at that warm water off our coast, there's the migration of the whales, largely explained by what's happening here. Domoic acid gets fostered in warmer water. And we're now seeing more domoic acid than previously. But the third one, and I think it's the biggest story nobody talks about because you can't see it, and for a group of people who are inspired by native plants, the kelp forest off our coast technically is not a plant. Now, I'm not a botanist, but kelp technically is an algae, right? So I don't know where that falls within the realm of the California Native Plant Society.
Okay.
It's usually terrestrial. I don't know of much, I'm sure that there are parts of the chapter that are into it, but again, this absolutely requires an entire separate talk to discuss what has happened to the bulk kelp forest. Because if we're going to talk about the profusion of life in the California current, a large part of the foundation for that are these forests of kelp. That's the habitat. So just a show of hands, how many people are aware of the plight of the kelp forest right off our coast in recent years? Virtually gone, virtually wiped out. Something similar happened off the coast of Australia or New Zealand, I want to say 2 or 3 decades ago.
Australia.
Never came back. It's been 20 or 30 years. And it wasn't a cyclical thing. It's almost like we talk about tipping points, like the meridional overturning, the day after yesterday stuff, the conveyor belts, that's a big tipping point that gets headlines a lot. But for the biological diversity in the California current off our coast, there are people working very hard to try and reverse what has happened. Like 90% of the bull kelp is gone. The Nature Conservancy is one of them. NOAA is another. Academic institutions, local communities. I don't know how many people go up to Mendocino and have ever come across Noyo, which is it's a native term for the bay up there. They're heavily invested because this changes that whole way of life up there. There's no more abalone fishing if you have no more kelp, among so many other things. And so much of the coastline from Mendocino and Sonoma has turned into what are called urchin barrens. I don't have any images for this because this is not the talk for this. It does deserve its own talk, and I think that the California Native Plant Society probably would really love to have this talk given.
Does this affect dramatically the upwelling of the nutrients in the water that you were talking
To
about?
my knowledge, no.
How could it not if the temperature has changed up?
Well, okay, it's a convoluted. I guess I'm misconstruing the answer to that question. When you have this particular situation where we're now kind of out of upwelling season, right? That's 5 months out of the year. So as you get into winter, you're not really so much in that because the constant northerly winds have ceased. So the upwelling also weakens. When you have a marine heat wave like this, that would also have an impact because you're clearly, in that case, you've got an intense marine heat wave in this image. At the same time, adjacent to it, you've not only got upwelling, but you've got more upwelling than normal. And I can say as a sign of positive hope, when we do see overcharged upwelling like that, so that's not 55-degree water, that's even cooler. Kelp forests start to rebound. But the kelp forest die-off story is much bigger than just getting the cooler water. I think that was what really tipped the scale because the blob, which you're seeing a representation of what the blob was. This is July of this year, and that very much looks like the blob. The difference was the blob never left. This is pretty darn close to never leaving. It's just not that strong all the time. But it was during that marine heat wave that the cascade happened. The sea stars, the sea star wasting disease took over. The kelp was weakened because the water was warm, and the urchin took over. Another missing piece to that story, by the way, are the sea otters, which used to be prolific. They used to remove the urchin, and they're not there anymore. It's a very complicated story, but the large canvas on which that catastrophe is played out, it was the marine heat wave which ultimately made it so easy for all that stuff to just take over. So that's kind of a downer.
Darren, does
Yeah.
the water along the coast mean that the water in the bay is cooler?
Not necessarily. The water in the bay is a bit different because it's constantly getting traded out. And that's a more complicated story, the water in the bay, which I'm not really an expert on in terms of, but I've seen oftentimes more than not, you can look at there is high resolution imagery for that. And oftentimes the water in the bay is warmer than what the climatological average of the last 30 years is now, but that's kind of beyond. The San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute, they're the ones who have a very deep knowledge on all that. And they'd probably be another great source for a talk here one day. So
At a lot of markets, it's 60s in the summer,
yeah,
and it's still almost in the 60s.
yeah. Okay. That finishes the talk on the California current. I'm just going to touch on two other brief concepts and then we will have accomplished the whole. It's 9 o'clock already. So for anybody who doesn't, I'll make this very short. Once we get done with upwelling season and we enter fall, kind of notorious, our warmest time of year. This is a map of the nation, which shows you, it's color-coded map showing you when on average you can expect your warmest day of summer. So you see it on the bottom for the scale. So June 1st, typically the deserts of southern New Mexico, that's their warmest part of summer, warmest part of the year. They still have July and August to go where they dodge that largely because of the summer monsoon. When you look at the coast of California, you see that narrow strip. The deeper a shade of red you go, the later into summer and into early autumn you go. And nobody's surprised, coastal California's warmest time of year happens in October, as you get into October. Again, completely a result of the loss of the influence of the California current. So the upwelling recedes, and we're now less insulated. We now have to experience the rest of the summer California's been having. Only, luckily for us, we don't show up to that party until October. So you can still get heat waves in October. And when they happen, we oftentimes are on the same level plane as the Central Valley. Like, you know, they'll usually get it a little worse, but, you know, San Francisco can has gotten into the hundreds recently. So one unique aspect to California's climate, and then the last image is this one, which was put together by a researcher down at Scripps, Michael Dettinger, who's also fantastic. And this was his way of visualizing the concept of how unique California's climate is in terms of our variability from year to year. So what you're seeing is a color-coded depiction of how far from average you can expect your winter to swing, whether above average or below average. This is not depicting above or below. It's just depicting how far in either direction from average your winter precipitation will swing. It's color-coded down on the bottom, and where you get into those deep shades of dark black there, where some parts of Southern California fall, that is up to 70%, meaning it's normal to expect from one winter to the next, you can swing wildly, as much as 70% off average, either above or below on rainfall. If you look at the Bay Area, we fall into that shade of light green, which is like 30 to 40%. So that means for us here in the Yerba Buena chapter of the Native Plant Society, we can expect any given winter to swing 30 to 40% from what the average is. Look at the entire east half of the country. You can expect each winter there typically to range 10%. So it's a hallmark of California's climate to do that. And this again brings us back to the term Daniel Swain introduced, weather whiplash. California's always done a version of weather whiplash. But what, and this, so it's always been that way.
So this map says 1981 to 2020. I'd love to see what it looked like, over
Right.
the last 50
In the
or 60
50s,
years.
right, in the 50s and 40s. He did update this. I think the one he made initially went up to 2010, and this is the most updated image, and it did become a little more prevalent. And if you bring it back, it's a little less prevalent, but it's still there. The nature of our climate is to swing wildly. California always would do that. But yes, that is, and I think that Denise, your question on this was in your text to me. We're now swinging more wildly, and that's a whole, again, talk for another day on California.
This is air temperature or rain?
Precipitation.
Thank you.
But the two and two can go hand in hand on that, because if you've got a very wet winter, chances are you're also more vulnerable to having a somewhat colder winter, although that's not necessarily right, not necessarily the case, but generally. So I think I'm going to end the talk here because we covered a lot of ground and it's 9 o'clock. So, yeah, thank you all for. I would have put a plant here, which is a representative of, the Yerba Buena's chapter's experience of swinging wildly from year to year. But we covered, I at least got a plant in this talk when we looked at it. Right.
Shit.
Are we going to hold that for one thought? Because I'll leave that up to you guys. Do we have time for questions? Do we want to do questions?
You got time,
I got nothing else.
So, last year, October, November, the National Weather Service issued unprecedented red flag wildfire warnings for the city of San Francisco. And on my phone, I get text alerts of police activity or high wind advisory, but I never thought anything about those wildfire warnings last fall. And I wondered, how do those messages get to us? Do you think it's even important that we know?
If there's a red flag warning where you live?
Yeah.
Well, the short answer to that is absolutely. The longer question to your question is, I don't necessarily remember a time where the city of San Francisco was actually included in a National Weather Service issued red flag. Does anybody else have that experience where you remember that happening?
We get them in Brisbane, but
Sure.
I've never heard of the city.
Now, you might have been outside of San Francisco and your phone was picking up on something, or?
No, I only know because of your weather reports.
Okay, well, that's a good way to know. So tell me your question again, and
Okay.
beyond should you know, absolutely, if you're within a red flag warning zone, you should know.
Well, how does the information get processed? Is it from a meteorologist? Like
Yeah.
yourself? And
Yes.
so would someone like yourself be notifying my Department of Emergency Management, or who would you?
Well, you touched on a very important point there. Red flag warnings aren't really for you. No, so you wouldn't get a notification on your phone. Even if you lived in wine country and there was a red flag warning. I'm 90% certain the National Weather Service is not sending out phone notifications for that. Because a red flag warning is not necessarily meant to be broadcast for the public. It is, the public needs that information because we want everybody to be smart. We want everybody to know, hey, if you did something irresponsible, this would be a really bad time because the conditions are primed for fire spread. But the initial motivation and intent of a red flag warning are for the agencies you mentioned. The agencies who have to respond. The National Weather Service started doing red flag warnings for them to say, heads up, the conditions are primed and you should be ready because if something does start, it can very quickly get out of hand. There's not a whole lot of information the general public can do with that other than to know, well, let me make sure I'm not dragging a chain and, by dry grass. That's important and helpful. And we have now started messaging this to the general public a lot more. But there's a little nuance to the red flag warning issue. Yes.
They.
Yes,
Certifies.
yeah. Yeah,
This is fabulous. Thank you so much.
thank you.
I don't think they're reducing the word climate change.
Right.
I'll be good. But no, we certainly talked about the warming.
Yes.
waters.
Yeah,
And.
talked about tipping points. I showed you
Okay.
aspects of here that are definite results of climate change. Absolutely.
Yeah.
When we looked at the sea surface temperatures, in terms, are you calling me out for not using the word storm?
I was fascinated by the time. I was waiting to hear it and.
Yeah,
It's very tricky, I know.
it's not tricky at all. Climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change. I'm not afraid to say it. Very, quite honestly, very few people are afraid to use that term. It's so embedded now, I believe, in everyone's awareness of where we are.
Do you use it?
Not necessarily. I will definitely take time out. If I've got time to discuss something that is relevant, I will. But there, 90% of what my job is to get people ready for the weather of now.
Right.
And while the weather of now is impacted and changed by climate change, and I have done that in forecast and will continue to do that in forecast, I do not make a point of finding ways or reasons to do it. If it's called for, I absolutely will. I have, and I'll do it again. Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
you use the word unprecedented.
definitely. That's a good one too.
Getting the word out about climate change.
I would think anybody who is alive and conscious has had ample opportunity to get exposure to this concept. It is their choice what to do with it from there. I'm not ramming it down people's throats.
No,
anymore.
and you
Yeah,
shouldn't, but
yeah.
you are sort of the voice. that
Yes.
a lot of
It's a conduit.
uneducated people.
Talks like this are a conduit to hopefully illuminate some of the concepts. That's why I wanted to have those sea surface temperature anomaly maps in there. That's why I wanted you guys to know the devastation that has taken place in the bull kelp forest. I think people must know, when you get into the nuanced things of there, I'm very dedicated to telling those stories and to tying them to climate change. There's definitely a cause and a reason there where I think it's necessary, especially if it's something so fundamentally disrupted and changed in an unprecedented way.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between feeling like an evangelist for people. People have already heard it. They've made their decision already. I'm not interested in having that conversation anymore.
But you have a much broader, you've got an audience and you have a much broader audience. And
Yeah.
I thought the way you handled, the way you talked tonight was brilliant.
Thank you.
And you don't need to show, you don't need
Right.
to read it, but
Right. Yeah.
because with your messaging and your.
You just talk about the
get it,
science.
You get it across.
So just having an open and honest discussion of the science, it's inevitable that climate change is going to be discussed and addressed as part of that. Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Do
Thank
the heat
you.
islands that we create in the cities have any effect on the weather too much? And is it about the marine layer?
Heat islands will have an effect locally, certainly. I can't think of any particular from a heat standpoint, other than the fact that urbanization does cause urban heat island effects. The marine layer is certainly capable of overpowering that influence when it takes over. But when you've got an intense heat wave in October, where there is no marine layer influence, those urban heat island effects will become more of a player and more of a factor on a localized scale.
What causes the heat island to absorb concrete absorbing?
So, yep, and then re-radiation, it absorbs and re-radiates it back out. It's a totally different transformation of the landscape than, sand dunes and Yucca Buena and hummingbird sage,
Trees,
We've been looking at that,
permeable pavement.
we've been looking at that map and relationships to artificial turf too, and it puts these real big blister spots, you can tell like where the artificial turf is.
yeah, yep. Yep. Yeah.
Where else do you lecture?
on CBS News Bay Area 5 nights a week. And there they limit me to 3 minutes. I was on tonight, actually. Yeah, I worked today because it was a big, there was a lot of weather coming in today, so I couldn't get to. Okay, what would you like to know about it?
No, I was able to see it through my phone.
Yeah, because your eye, the iris on your lens was able to resolve it out. Where were you? No clouds.
Nice. But, yeah, so like, talk about it for 5 seconds.
Okay, sure. If I was given a broad canvas to just talk about it. So the sun goes through an 11-year cycle from minimum to maximum and back to minimum. That whole thing takes 11 years. We reached maximum last year. 2024 was the maximum. If you guys think about it, we were hearing about the Northern Lights a lot more last year. We're now on the downtrend of that, but we're still near the maximum. I mean, granted, if it's an 11-year cycle, 5.5 up, 5.5 down, we're only a year past the maximum. So we're still getting coronal mass ejections that are reaching our atmosphere and able to excite the electric. I'm not an expert on all that stuff, but I do think an awareness of the sun, the cycles that it goes through. For me, the aurora borealis, obviously, first and foremost, is the experience of seeing it can be really enlightening and transformative. I've seen it once. I've never seen it here. I never did the phone thing. That summer, to bring us all the way back to the start of this talk, that summer I was in Montana, I saw that. Yeah, but even then it was faint. And I don't know what cycle we were in 1995. I've never thought to go back and look at it, but that's the summer I was there. One last thing I'll say about this burst of Northern Lights. Just about exactly 30 days ago, we had another one. And here's a little concept of the sun, which I think everybody should know, and I don't know that most people do. The sun rotates, and it does a complete revolution every 30 days from our standpoint. So right now, you know what the sunspots look like, right? We typically see sunspots when you visualize the sun through different filters of ultraviolet, X-ray. You can see the sunspots. There is a huge coronal hole shaped like a heart right now. It was there in the middle of September, and it's around the edges of those where these flares happen. Something to do about the magnetism on the sun being a little bit weaker in those locations, and the coronal mass ejections are able to escape more easily where you get those. So 30 days ago, there was another brush with Northern Lights. It just wasn't as strong, so it didn't make headlines. And now here we are, no coincidence, 30 days later, and we're doing it again. And that sunspot has pretty much held its shape. Still kind of looks like a heart, and it's still pointed directly at us, at least for the next, 5, 6, 7 days before it rotates around, and we're no longer in its direct pathway.
So those something like ice every day, so we'll see very much.
If that hole maintains, right? I doubt 30 days from now it's still going to be you never know. It could, but
Bigger.
could get bigger. It could wax or wane. I don't know. But to me, that was one of the more fascinating things about the recent maximum was elevating our awareness of this stellar center of our, it's so fundamental. The joke about this talk that I kept telling myself is I kept unwinding it, right? I was going to go into the Pacific Gyre. I brought you guys to Japan. At some point, I got to stop. Because I could have gone all the way back to the fusion happening at the center of the sun to explain why there's convection on Earth. So I had to stop this conversation somewhere.
Well, you showed that one slide when the current, Pacific, and in the middle, there was that area, that's where the gyre is.
How fun is it to say that, by the way?
Yeah.
The gyre.
Down the gyre in 1986, from San Francisco to Hawaii.
Cool.
It was very rare. And it wasn't as nearly as gigantic as it is now.
Right.
But
The
it
garbage
was-
patch, you're talking about the garbage patch,
Yeah,
right?
But there was like floating styrofoam cooler with like 30 feet of stuff growing on it, but you could still read the cooler.
Budweiser.
No, it had to be cooler, And yeah, take blue or something like that. It was a brand that started with T. But it just, the area was like really, really, really smooth and just kind of like this undulating where the other parts of the ocean were more exciting.
Wow.
Some of them too exciting.
One other aspect to that, which I didn't get into in this talk, because I really was going to go deeper down the weeds on the whole gyre thing. You guys are lucky. That was just really would have gone off the rails. But the center of the gyre, everything's rotating clockwise. Everything is also kind of, the water is kind of getting pulled into the center of the gyre. The center of the gyre is 4 feet taller than the rest of the ocean. The water is piling up there. And generally it's a 4 foot tall hill. And that hill, yeah, unfortunately, that hill and the water pouring off subtly off the top of that hill on an ocean-wide scale, now the Coriolis force is coming into play. And the whole reason why the gyre rotates, not because of the wind, it rotates because of that water, as it's pouring off the crest of that hill, is getting caught up in the Coriolis. And that's why we have gyre. It's not because of the wind. Yeah, so we got there in the talk. Yeah,
There it is.
yeah.
And to come back from Hawaii to San Francisco in summertime, you can't just go like on a sailboat. You have to go,
Gotta go around the trade lanes.
yeah, you gotta go to latitude 38 before you make the great turn to San
Yeah.
Francisco.
Otherwise, you're going right headlong into the wind. But the trip to Hawaii from here is
It's
great.
very nice, I didn't know that.
That's the whole thing too, you know, with a jet. Why is it? It's faster from here to New York than from New York to here. That's-
Thanks.
You're welcome.
This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. Okay, please, please, back to your regularly scheduled lives.
No, it was just, this was like,
Yeah, it's really.
It's funny, it was mine too.
Darren, thank you so much.
That's
Amazing.
Thanks.
And I'm gonna go ahead and stop the sharing. And I am assuming that someone else answered anything in the chat. Susan was there. Great.
The tubes.
And the globes.
And the globe then comes up. Yeah. So, you know, TV forecast of student from green screen. Okay, for decades. And all the green screen was a flat wall. Okay. So you couldn't project anything, you know, as long as you were not the same color as the wall. you could- Oh, so that. So it's not showing any view. Right. They shows, exactly, they devised what, so I'm holding on a pen.
Right.
Yeah. Built into that iPad is a tracker which reads a box around me that tells the camera to know where I am and incorporate me so that I'm in the 3D space with these images, so I can walk in front of them. If I wasn't holding that tracker, you know, I'd go digital two, I would go, oh, so yeah, no, right, and they are fixed in our mind and in the system, in location. So I know where that 7 days is gonna come out, because it always comes up in the same place. But the reality of my experience in that moment, I'm sitting in a giant green room here. It's not just a green wall. It's green floor, curving walls, every wall is green. It's open. You see it? I only see it above the TV because I have longer than it looks like. Okay. Which is what we always. For the last 30 years, same thing with the green screen. I didn't see anything unless I looked at monitor rather than that sort of that showed me what we were seeing, so that I knew where I was.
When you first do this, was yes,
But you get used to it much faster than you would think. You really do. It's just a matter of kind of getting situated that you're in. It goes away. Okay.
Whenever we watch the news, and you see always, and notice that you leave no shadow, and plus it doesn't cast. It's not new. That's the word of what. It's really what.
When we started, we made a plan showing us, like we say, in the first incident, say, all right, what you're saying, we're gonna turn off the system and now you'll see reality where I am. Just get it that way, but it's not doing it. No, we stopped doing it. Thanks for great, great day.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation.
I think this was back.
Actually, of course, I know you're a professional speaker. But you could speak.
Oh,
You're sleep. Oh, wow. It's great.
I don't think we did on TV, but yeah, your daughter's going to have that too.
She has a fair amount of speech. Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Butterfly.
So great. I like how you people explore you were taking I think I was stayed on, it was great. It was nice. You're now.
Yeah.
Oh, indeed, has been. The first one is my life.